sort of in broad terms, just so we can have an idea of this going forward, in case anyone may be unfamiliar, um, what exactly do airborne divisions of the Army do? Like, what is their role within the Army?
Well, yeah, okay, great. So we have the United States Army today has one. You talking about today or in the 40s?
We'll go with today, and then we'll go to the back to the origins after.
Sure, sure. Yeah. So today, the Army has one airborne division and two brigades, one in Italy and one in Alaska. And let me backtrack. And then you have the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell.
Mhm.
And then really in Alaska, it's named the 11th Airborne Division, but one brigade out of the two are on jump status. And this is where I get a little bit away from myself here. I like to think of airborne as more than just jumping
Yeah.
parachutes, but we tend to, and I just was a victim of my own thing I'm trying to eradicate, is thinking of just parachutes when we say airborne, right? And so, but it's not that. It's more than that, right? It's definitely, to me, it's really anything, moving troops through the air, be it by helicopter or in the 40s glider, parachute, now helicopters, or any other thing that might be invented. Certainly airplanes that and so on. But so now the major role is to move quickly to seize and hold ground, and most often the 82nd practices that in the form of airfield seizures to snag an airfield and control it and run it to then bring in airplanes that land and bring in more combat power
Mm,
and expand their lodgement from there, and to do whatever whatever U.S. national interests called them to do.
right.
And then very similar in World War II. I mean, in the 40s it was a similar mission. It kind of started, with the idea of smaller units, sabotage kind of stuff, right? Send them behind enemy lines
Mm,
to do that sort of thing. But it kind of grew to larger operations, and they sort of assumed, and airborne units today as well, a role kind of like the old school um, cavalry, right?
mhm.
And especially in World War II, they're doing cavalry type missions and screening in front of friendly forces, jumping in front of friendly forces to screen from enemy counterattack. Normandy being and Sicily being pretty prominent examples. Deep penetration raids, Market Garden kind of fits that mold
Yeah.
to a degree, or the 101st and the famous left hook, right, in Desert Storm, right, kind of fits that mold. But 100 some odd years before that, that would have been people on horses, right, doing the
Yeah.
same idea. So they kind of fit that mold in World War II, more like a strategic cavalry sort of idea. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of the role. Sorry, long-winded again. I tend to
No,
do
no,
that,
no, it's good.
as we historians do. It's a trait.
Yeah, yeah, it's good.
I think we learn it in grad school to
Right.
just ramble.
No, I love it. Yeah, so let's go back to the origins. This is interesting because I had never had any sort of concept of this until I actually watched Band of Brothers, which I'm sure you've seen and are familiar with. So the airborne divisions were created sort of in the build up to U.S. involvement in World War II. Can you walk me through uh, the decision making behind that, sort of the necessity for airborne units?
Sure. Yeah. So we'll go back even further. In 1918, Billy Mitchell of the United States Army Air Corps proposes the idea of dropping the First Infantry Division with parachutes from 1918 era bomber wings behind enemy lines to get around the trenches in World War One. Trench warfare in World War One really, inspires a lot of innovation that in maneuver that you see in World War Two. A lot of the technology is pretty much the same, and by the end of World War One, a lot of the maneuver ideas, are the same stuff we see later in World War Two.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of where it to me it's sort of born from the idea of like trench warfare sucks. Like how do we not do that again? That is bad, right? So let's put people over, vertically envelop them instead of enveloping them through flanks,
Well,
right? So that's sort of the big idea. Uh, the Soviets. and the Germans are pretty well ahead of the United States during the interwar period of this, Soviets particularly. But a lot of these ideas are percolating, throughout the world. The United States sort of gets involved really heavily after the Germans in Operation Mercure, Operation Mercury, when they dropped into sent an airborne unit, the Fallschirmjäger, into Crete, which is interesting because for the Germans, that's like, okay, this is terrible. We're not doing that anymore.
Mm,
We'll use them as sort of elite infantry, but no more of this airborne only stuff. Um, but for the United States, they're like, "Oh, look at this! Look what we could do. We could if
yeah.
we could do a little better. We'll be good." And so that from there, a lot of innovation goes into that, in sort of the thinking army at Fort Benning, and the Pentagon. And so this guy by the name of Bill Lee, he becomes a major general. He was the commander of the 101st, but has some health issues, and so he does not get to see them take them into combat. But he is sort of the the true patriarch, right? The architect of the airborne, and he gets everything going at Fort Benning with initially, some very small units that grow and grow and grow into by 1942, you have two airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Division. And the 101st actually, they take the 82nd and split it down the middle and then start building from there.
Mm,
And so there's a lot of debate on how they're going to do it. Right, the initial idea, pardon me, is to have two glider regiments and one parachute regiment. Right, and so that's sort of how they train. The idea being that parachute troops can go in first and secure the landing areas. Then you can bring in gliders into other landing areas and then bring in more combat power that way. Um, but as a lot of things in history, it doesn't go that way because when they're getting ready to ship the 82nd over to the Mediterranean, there's not enough room on the boats for
mm,
two glider regiments and the gliders. So they cut one glider regiment and then add Colonel Gavin's 505th to the 504th, and so then they go with two parachute and one glider, and then ship off to the
hmm.
war. And then eventually the 101st kind of adopts that model as well.
Yeah. That's interesting. So the ideas of airborne units were actually simmering during World War One. This is something that always fascinates me about World War Two and sort of the time period between World War One and World War Two is the innovation, like you mentioned, because we did have planes in World War One, but they were very rudimentary. And then by World War Two, we have the skies filled with thousands of bombers and jet engine fighter planes and just the advancement, the technological advancement just in that really 30-year period is astronomical and just opens up so many possibilities of um battlefield tactics and warfare tactics, especially with tanks too. I'd really like to do an episode on this one day with Patton and sort of the innovation with tanks, but this is interesting. Um, so they're training, these airborne divisions are created, and they kind of start early on in North Africa, and you mentioned Sicily. But I'd particularly like to talk about D-Day because obviously this is sort of their biggest event, I guess you could call it, in World War II, and one that we see again, harkening back to Band of Brothers. This is a really big moment in the show. Um, so, what was sort of their role on D-Day? Because when we think of D-Day, we think of these guys storming the beaches of Normandy and Saving Private Ryan and everything. But we dropped a ton of guys behind enemy lines in Normandy, which is insane because the rudimentary technology of the time, they have no idea where they landed, where they are in proximity to the enemy, where they are in proximity to their friends and everyone else. What direction they're in. They probably lost equipment on the way down. It's just insane to think that it's 1944 and these guys are jumping out of planes into enemy territory, into battle. Um, so, okay, can you sort of illuminate this story for us? What was their role and their impact at D-Day?
Yeah, so I'll back up a little bit. Um, so coming out of it, end of 1943, right? There's a lot of questions. Eisenhower doesn't like the idea of a division operation. There's a lot of questions, kind of figuring out how he wanted to use them as smaller units. So going in, but that kind of gets overridden. There's some good training and some good new plans coming together, and ideas, doctrine, right, to
Mhm.
to mitigate some of the problems that happened specifically at Operation Husky in July 1943 in Sicily. So this gets solved. That's where you see the invasion stripes right on the airplanes, the
Yeah.
three stripes to help prevent fratricide and other stuff. So then planning gets down really in January. General Gavin, who's now the assistant division commander of the 82nd, he gets moved up to England on the planning staff with Ike and everybody, and they start planning the invasion. Well, couple of ideas, before the actual plans finalized, were one of which, and this is from General Marshall, bless his soul. He proposed landing the airborne divisions like basically halfway between Paris and the beaches.
Oh, wow.
Secure an airfield and then bring in another division by airplane, which is like, oh my goodness, that would have been out of control.
It's
So
ambitious.
that fortunately doesn't happen. Yeah, there's a great paper that somebody wrote actually at I think the Command and General Staff College that I found. It's all these like canceled airborne operations in World War II. It was really helpful to help me find sources and just fast. Like they were going to capture Rome. That was a plan. Was to do Rome in '43. But anyway, so that was one plan, and then they start. Okay, let's look at the Normandy beachhead area, right? And how can we use airborne forces to help in this place? And so if you look at the overall picture of all the allies, right? All the beaches. The British are on the far eastern flank, the British airborne forces, and the American airborne forces are on the western flank. The 82nd and the 101st, where they were going to go, the 82nd was going to be even further, west into the Continental Peninsula. But once they discovered there's a hill there they wanted them to secure. Once they discovered some of the Germans' anti-airborne, anti-glider defenses, there's this thing called Rommel's asparagus, which is basically telephone
Yeah.
poles,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
To tear the gliders up as they're trying to land, and then what they didn't know is the flooding of the fields. But so
Mhm.
they bring them a little closer in, adjust the drop zones, and the main purpose of all the airborne units is to screen enemy forces. That's the big picture, right? From reinforcing the beachhead. In the American sector, the 82nd and 101st, they're really the 82nd is tasked to secure Saint-Mary-Glisse, which is a critical crossroads, critical town, and it becomes the first French town to be liberated. And then the 101st, one of their main objectives is the La Barquette locks and the lock system that's right in sort of in between kind of Utah and Omaha Beach, to secure that. And then with Saint Mary Glisse, there's two key bridges over the Margaret River that the 82nd is responsible for. And one of which becomes an incredible fight that lasts days at the Lafayette Bridge. And then the 101st, one of the most famous objectives they have is the artillery, right? Breakcore Manor fight the
Yeah.
Dick Winters earned his DSC there, um, and which is obviously immortalized in episode 2 of Band of Brothers,
Yep.
which everybody loves, which came out like right before. I think it came out like right before 9/11 or right after. I can't remember. So it's like, yeah, it's so intertwined with all anyway. But yeah, so that's sort of the major role of the airborne
Wow.
on D-Day.
Yeah, that's incredible. So, I mean, how did they link up with the forces storming the beaches? Because you gotta think, you have these forces storming the beaches, and then you have the airborne divisions landing behind enemy lines, and you obviously have all these enemy forces in between. So, I mean, what's the process of linking up with the forces?
Yeah, careful using signals, right? And predetermined, right, signals to do so. The first link up was with the 8th Infantry, and oh my gosh, the 101st. I think it was some folks from the 501st, but because they're kind of scattered, right, it wasn't necessarily supposed to be. But I think that was their sector,
Yeah.
and one of their roles was because that was their other role was to secure the causeways coming off the beach, right? In addition to the locks. And so the 101st and the 4th Infantry Division are the ones who link up first.